weather is covered almost as a separate thing from climate. Like I hear on the radio when they talk about exceptionally hot weather, and it's sort of treated as a very positive story. Oh, great, you be able to get your barbecues out, sort of thing. And you find yourself thinking, yeah, this is quite disconnected from the longer story.
Hey, it's Richard Delavan. Welcome back to Wicked Problems. I am delighted that we're going to be joined in a minute by Mick Wright, who you just heard a clip of there. He is the guy behind one of the biggest kind of Substacks out there, Conquest of the Useless, journalist who's worked in The Telegraph, who's worked in Q and Stuff and Wired, Inc., all sorts of other places. And he has written a new book called Breaking: How the Media Works, when it doesn't, and why it matters, which is a fantastic read. And we were able to have a quick go at that before having a chance to speak to him. It's going to be coming out in a couple of weeks. So we wanted to get this interview in and for you to have a chance to pre-order, which, as you know, helps authors that are trying to get their stuff out there. Not Mick's first time at this, but he was very generous and gave us like the guts of an hour to talk about it. Now, I had a little bit of a technical issue, trying to do a little bit too much, and because doing it something from the road before a meeting, and so we did some slight technical challenges. I do not understand why in 2025, in the capital city of a G7 country, it's impossible to get decent mobile data, but that's where we are in 2025. I don't know what to tell you. So look, it's going to be a great chat. We'll get into a little bit about climate, this kind of fake Bothsidesism that has plagued journalism, whether journalism itself is going to survive the age of AI, where there might be green shoots, as he talks about, and where there might be some challenges. So it's a great conversation. Mick is a great storyteller, and I think you're going to enjoy it. And I want to just mention while I'm here that if you come to wickedproblems.earth and become a supporter, we would greatly appreciate it, whether that's just helping us out by spreading the word, sharing this with somebody else, subscribing to our YouTube channel, or indeed becoming a full member at wickedproblems.earth, so that you can help us to make sure that we actually have some folks who can help make sure that I don't find myself in situations where I'm trying to do stuff on the hoof, and making sure we just put out the best product we can, the best interviews we can get, the best conversations that are going to help make this very interesting moment in the world, and that Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, just a little more understandable and hopefully a little more fun. Now, here's my conversation. Well, actually, first we're going to have Mick Wright's going to do a dramatic reading, my favorite section of the book. So let's give it over to him.
In August 2022, shortly after she left the BBC after 21 years, but before launching Global's News Agents podcast alongside her former BBC colleagues Lewis Goodall and John Sopel, Emily Maitlis gave them a Taggart Memorial Lecture, the keynote address at the influential Edinburgh International TV Festival. She took the audience back to 2016 and explained, "It might take our producers 5 minutes to find 60 economists who feared Brexit and 5 hours to find a sole voice who espoused it, but by the time we went on air, we simply had one of each. We presented this unequal effort to our audience as balance. It wasn't. I would later learn the ungainly name for this myopic style of journalism, Bothsidesism, which talks to the way it reaches a superficial balance while obscuring a deeper truth. At this stage, I'd never heard the term, or indeed the criticism. I just thought we were doing our job." The speech stretched my credulity so thoroughly that it felt like he'd done a full hour of hot yoga by the time it was finished. It was bizarre to hear someone who had until very recently been one of the BBC's most prominent political interviewers claim that she hadn't encountered the idea of false balance, or it being wielded as a criticism of the corporation until Brexit and Trump. 2 years before the Brexit referendum, a year-long inquiry by a UK Parliamentary Select Committee concluded that BBC news teams consistently engaged in false balance when reporting on climate change stories. So for a senior news journalist to suggest that they weren't familiar with the concept felt like a very stark confession. Head back even further to the misty, almost unimaginable past of 2006, and you'll find Rob Corddry on The Daily Show parodying journalists who bent over backwards to establish balance where there is none. How does one report the facts when the facts themselves are biased? From the names of our fallen soldiers to the gradual withdrawal of our allies to the growing insurgency, it's become all too clear that the facts in Iraq have an anti-Bush agenda. Mateless's speech was rightly praised for highlighting the influence of Conservative Party appointees on the BBC, but it also contained a series of confessions about missing the elephant in the room, even as the stench of dung must have been stifling.
Those were the dulcet tones of Mick Wright, author of the new book, Breaking: How the Media Works and Why It Matters When It Doesn't, and also the proprietor of Conquest of the Useless, a must-read newsletter on Substack, formerly of Wired, Q, Stuff, The Telegraph, and Kernel. Might come to that. Mick Wright, man, thanks for coming on.
No problem. Pleasure to be here.
As I mentioned, we did have some technical challenges. Don't worry, they do get resolved. But I do just want to let you know the next couple of minutes, I'll be dubbing in the questions that I asked Mick, because frankly, the recording didn't work on my side because of various things. But it's fixed, and from a few more minutes in, it's just a normal conversation, so bear with us. I asked Mick why he decided to write a book about what journalism was doing wrong at this time. This is what he had to say.
As I say in the book, if you want a book that's about heroes in journalism, All the President's Men is still in print. But I think the reason that I wanted to do this book and to focus on the bad stuff is that I think it's important to understand why bad journalism happens, how it happens, the systematic reasons for it, but also the personal and interpersonal reasons for it. And I think if you understand what bad journalism is and why it happens, it's a lot easier to spot the good stuff, basically. So I think, it's an attempt to try and give people the tools to separate the wheat from the chaff, really.
And then is how we got here.
I think there was a period in the past. If you go back to the 80s and 90s, there were media critics working in the newspapers. There were media criticism columns. There was a sense of analysing the way the British press worked, particularly, and that sort of went away in the same way that a lot of other specialist correspondents went away, like industrial correspondents who covered trade unions in the past. I think also you look back to Leveson. I think after Leveson, there was almost a kind of snap back to being extremely unwilling to look too closely. It's sort of like, well, we've got over that. We've got past that. We've avoided that being implemented too much. We're just going to move away from that. And I think also there's just a sense that the media really enjoys applying scrutiny to other industries, and it rightly applies scrutinies to other parts of society. But it's hard to do it to yourself. That's kind of just a human nature question as well.
In the excerpt at the top, Mick had pointed out this disparity between, on the one hand, the Parliamentary Committee criticizing the BBC for false balance when it comes to reporting about climate change, something we discussed with David Schuckman on the show last year, and his battles to try and help move the corporation to stating what was perfectly obvious. So I guess my question to Mick was, have we regressed, given what happened with that milestone on climate? But as the quote from Emily Maitlis points out, the false balance, the Bothsidesism, is rampant, not just in British media, but other places.
Yeah, I think there is a certain level of regression. I mean, one of the reasons I think I do, looking back, I haven't written the book now, I do think, yeah, should I have covered climate more? But I felt it had been well covered in other areas, and it's one of those. It perhaps has improved to some extent, but then we still have the problem where the weather is covered almost as a separate thing from climate. So it's like I hear on the radio when they talk about exceptionally hot weather, and it's sort of treated as a very positive story. Oh, great, you be able to get your barbecues out, sort of thing, and you find yourself thinking, yeah, this is quite disconnected from the longer story. I think some of that is to do with novelty and the fact that covering events in isolation is a lot easier than covering events as indicative of a longer term trend. So it's easier to put a reporter out in a big storm with their umbrella bending and they're getting battered by the rain, and you just tell the story of the storm as an event that's happening there and then, rather than telling it as a feature of changing climate. So I think that's partly it as well. There is a human problem with bringing things back to longer term trends. Things often the news is told as literally what is happening in that moment. I think one of the things is when you come back to look at a book after you've written it, you find yourself thinking, what else could have been in there, or what could I have done? What else could I have included? And it's already a fairly long book.
And this, dear listener and viewer, is the moment where we got things back on track. You'll be pleased to know no more weird interruptions from me.
Sorry about that. So thanks for your patience. All right. So I think we were talking about the inability to look at systemic issues and the preference for things that are more immediate. I think on the climate side, we were also talking about the fact that we have a proclivity for, let's say it's a really sunny day, let's put pictures of girls in bikinis on the front page, or picture of people doing barbecue.
Yeah.
So I think that's, I guess it's kind of the nature of the beast, though, isn't it? It's kind of like, I suppose it's hard to know what to say to an assignment editor when they can see the the clicks and what's actually going to drive traffic, what's going to drive eyeballs, and it usually isn't like you're all going to die and therefore eat your broccoli.
Yeah, I mean that's the difficult part of it as well. Is that ultimately in an attention economy, and in an attention economy where news organizations are now competing with many, many other things that can take that attention, that you are not going to want to be the purveyor of bad news all the time, or the purveyor of not even bad news, complex news all the time, and the tendency to offer up the cream cakes over the green vegetables is completely understandable from an economics point of view.
Yeah. No, I get, and I think the book came out a long time ago now, but The Death of Gentlemanly Capitalism, about the Big Bang in the city, where, like there were just different rules before, and people observed norms that didn't have to be told, they didn't have to write them down, they didn't have to, hold back from doing certain things or making certain trades. And it's just the same thing applying in media, it feels like, and you've lived through that experience.
Yes.
And that's created a vacuum, for this kind of space for particularly people like myself in my bad old days, working in communications, to fill the gap, to provide all the material. Could you say more about, you could write about that extensively in the book. Could you say more about that?
A huge amount of what is published in the British press on any given day is the result of surveys and press releases and sell-ins from PR people, and it is advertising disguised as news. That's been the case for a very long time. You go back to Nick Davies writing about it in Flat Earth News, that continues to be the case, if not, and has been driven even more so, partly also because a lot of in a lot of particularly local newsrooms, or what is left of the local press, you've got a small number of people with a requirement to pump out a lot of stories, and you can't go out and do reporting if you have to just pump out a sheer volume of material. And that means that when people are offering you easy wins in terms of content, they get taken. Another issue, and it was what one of the news agency owners was saying recently, is stuff like that. The decline in court reporting has meant that quite often now news stories on cases in Crown Court are being based on press releases coming from the police, which is obviously going to heavily distort the way that reporting on crime and justice in areas is going to look. So yeah, there's a lot of that, and that is an issue. I mean, I in the notes for this, we've got the phrase "the rise of journalism." I think journalism has risen and is there now, and is uh, vastly swamping real reporting at this point.
Right. And it's something that, again, that trend doesn't look like it's about to reverse itself.
No.
Absent some kind of fundamental change in the economic and political structure of, Western countries. But is there, I mean, I suppose we have gone back and forth over the years there, whether it's, kind of fit and proper person, who can own what. That's, there's very little restriction on it, but I do wonder if there's an appetite at some point for people to push back on that. I mean, do you have any thoughts about whether or not we might see, post the death of Rupert Murdoch, someone come along and say maybe we shouldn't do that again?
We've sort of gone. We've sort of had another decline in the sense that now we've had a change in the ability of foreign governments to have stakes in British news organisations. Now, it looked like the Telegraph bid was going to be stopped on the basis that there was too much UAE money in it, and now this Labour government has said no, it's fine. As long as it's only 15%, that's fine, and that was pushed as well by Murdoch and Rothermere, who has now got a stake in the Telegraph as well. So no, I think that the fitness and properness of media ownership is going in the wrong direction as well. With the sense of saying it's fine to have foreign states have stakes in big British media organisations.
And I suppose one of the things that people were hoping would be that there would be a efflorescence of local citizen journalists to help fill the gap. Like in the heady days of 2005, when people were predicting all sorts of utopian things for the internet, that doesn't seem to have worked out 20 years later.
Well, there are some positive things to look to. If you look to things like the Manchester Mill and the other local news sites that have come out of the company behind the Manchester Mill, that's interesting. That's a model where there are new independent journalism to get filling in and coming into the space where more old school local newspapers have let things down. Same thing if you look at what Jim Waterson is doing in London with London Centric. So there are some sort of green shoots and suggestions that there are some models that seem to be working and that people, investigative local reporting and other stuff in other places in the world, things like ProPublica, looking at non-profits that do investigative reporting and then put that reporting into more traditional newspapers. So it's not all negative. I think the thing about things like BuzzFeed were that they came up around a time when low interest rates and a lot of venture capital money sloshing around, and they grew probably too fast and on a heady diet of financing that just isn't there anymore. So that was a problem. You look at BuzzFeed, HuffPost, those kind of things. They were not built in a sustainable manner. And another interesting one to look at, of course, is you look at the New York Times, and the New York Times there were predictions that when it put its paywall up in the mid 2000s, that there would be it would totally suffer. And actually, it's done very well. But of course, actually, what is the New York Times now? It's a cooking, sports, and puzzles business that has a legacy news organization attached to it. So that can be slightly deceptive in a way.
Well, I did notice that Jim on Blue Sky was noting that he was spending his Saturday morning writing up invoices to send them to the papers that had nicked the content that they'd created bespoke for the London Centric. So I'm not challenging what you're saying. I just think it's it feels like it's going to be a slog unless the courts uphold his kind of right to create intellectual property and have it protected.
Yeah, it's why I only call it green shoots, rather than anything more than that at this point.
Fair. Let's talk a little bit about a different topic, because again, you've written for Wired. We cover a lot of tech on this show. Your reflections on the media enthusiasm for innovation and wondering this is the new shiny thing, and wondering if what you're seeing and what you're writing in the book about whether that's heading in a better direction or whether we're, again, regressing as we are on some of the other fronts in terms of just not chasing the shiny thing of tech, or is that kind of where we're stuck?
I think Wyatt's always had a problem with a kind of over caffeinated techno optimism. I mean, it's interesting because the mixture of I wrote for Wyatt for quite a short time, and the three big pieces I wrote for them were, one was very positive, which was the about the Impossible Project, which brought back Polaroid from the dead. You know, they thought that the supplies of chemicals gone. There was no way to make that instant film in the way they had done in the past, and they brought that back from the dead. Another was very negative about the death of Kodak and its slowness to embrace digital and the decline of Kodak. And the third was very negative and about Stuxnet, the worm that was probably created by Israel and the US to destroy Iranian nuclear plants. So I never was in the kind of tech optimism side with Wired, but of course I wrote for Stuff, and Stuff was like was and is a wildly, you know, consumerist magazine about like new gadgets every month. Here's new gadgets all the time, and I think we're still in that consumerist mindset, even as, you know, the world and the state of the world is showing us that we need to be learning to reuse and replace and repair in a way that would be very good. But no, I don't think that. I think there's this, we're still in a kind of weird 80s, 90s hangover of that, the consumerism and the hype cycle thing. I almost think that people are hoping that what happened with the hole in the ozone layer and getting rid of CFCs and, you know, repairing the hole in the ozone layer, I think people are acting like, well, if we wait long enough, that'll happen with climate. And I think that is worrying. I think that there is a sort of sense of kind of crossing fingers and thinking, well, you know, if we wait long enough, things will fix themselves. And obviously that's not the case.
No, and I was just briefly guilty as anybody else in the trade back in 06, 07, running the business section of a paper in Ireland. And people, as you do, you know, they send you stuff to review, right? To review. And I remember getting it was like a flip phone from Ericsson or something. And anyway, I wrote it. I said it was terrible. I got this shitty email from the PR saying, oh, well, you know, like Ericsson's very upset. Again, I'm making this up. It could be a different brand. But they wrote back saying, well, I realize the corporations have legal personality, but didn't realize they actually have emotions. So the idea that the company is upset, that's interesting. Say more about that and put that in the paper too. So they really didn't like that. Anyway, that's why I never got, they stopped sending me stuff, weirdly enough, in Dublin. After that, I wonder why.
Yeah, that'll happen.
There you go. But I think, you know, but I do think climate is like you say, you know, we're all hoping for some magic, you know, beans to come along and save us. And that is what's going to drive, you know, not just coverage, but investment. You know, it just seems like, you know, there's no way to get around that. Because again, like people just don't like talking about broccoli. Even today, we're talking on the 28th of May. You know, the story this morning is that, you know, there's an 80% chance that we're going to be at, you know, passing the 1.5 threshold for the next 5 years, or at least one of the years, you know, that'll be the hottest on record. You know, that we're likely to hit 2 degrees C between now and 2035. And, you know, when people said that in 2018, you know, people were on the streets the following year. I just don't see that happening at the moment, possibly because we're just exhausted.
I think the other problem is we've got there's this tendency also to write stories that make it more about personal responsibility and saying we as individual consumers, we've got, you know, how to recycle more, how to do whatever. And a lot of times I feel that you look in it's not surprising that that media companies that are big companies that who have advertisers who are big companies focus more on individual responsibility than systematic and corporate responsibility and the responsibility of, you know, vast big companies and states to make changes. This idea that it's about individuals is, it's a sort of, they would say that, wouldn't they, kind of situation.
Yeah, no, that's not going to be around that. Look, you mentioned earlier on the war for attention, and I think you do devote a little bit of time in the book to talking about AI. So, I mean, what's the bull case for AI being any good, or is there one? Before we get into the obvious downsides,
the case for AI being useful in journalism is to do with is for automated stuff like earnings reports. Nikkei and some of those companies have been the FT, other companies like that have been using it for earnings reports and things that are a lot of data and reflecting data changes. That's quite useful. Going through huge amounts of data quickly, very useful. But the benefits of AI to reporting, I think, are vastly overstated, because in the end, what reporting has to be is talking to lots of people and going out into the world and observing things that AI cannot do unless, someone creates a general intelligence, which I have doubts about whether they'll ever do, and certainly not for a very long time. I think AI is very dangerous for journalism, because what it does in the end is makes it look even more like a commodity to audiences, to readers, to viewers, to listeners, and it damages trust, and it erodes a sense of what is true. And my argument has been that journalists and writers in general, journalists, writers, creators in any form, should be really talking about AI generated text and video in the same way that we talk about ultra processed foods, and arguing for a world in which organically produced media is seen as the best and the gold standard, and something that we should be defending and pushing for.
Right. I mean, it's interesting framing, and I think it's not a bad one. I mean, did you see the story in the States where a piece of AI generated content about book reviews or recommendations for the summer made it into print in the Chicago Sun-Times and the Philadelphia Inquirer? Like, I read that guy's post on Facebook that copying to it, and just devastated, knows he's never going to work again in anything pretty much. And it's just I mean, you could imagine. Will we get better at it? Will we get better at discriminating between, making a dumb mistake like that, or lawyers using it to create citations of cases that don't exist and wanting to get disbarred? Will we learn from that, do you think?
Yeah, over time, I mean, people will learn. I guess it's like how we've learned with any kind of tool, but I suppose this could be me being over optimistic, like we were talking about other people being over optimistic around climate. But I hope that we might come to realize that generative AI being used to create copy is a mistaken time saver, and that we should be using AI for things like that it's good at, like identifying cancers, for instance, or looking at perhaps new drug molecules. But the idea of it as a tool for people who are writing and creating things, I think we should be pushing back hard on it. Because I don't think it. The other thing that it doesn't get better in is it's a little bit like Mad Cow, where feeding cows on other cows created ever more mutations and problems. If eventually, AI models have to be fed on something, and if everything becomes, if we swamp the world with generative AI output, then what are the models then feeding on? More generative AI output, and eventually, that way a form of digital madness lies.
And are you again, it's a little bit outside of both of our scope, but are you you have any views or optimism or pessimism about whether or not some of these cases of media brands and authors taking some of these AI companies to court for taking their work as training material, because to your point, if it removes the economic incentive for a lot of that creation, then we end up in this death spiral of just AIs copying AIs, like you say, mad cows eating cows.
I had some optimism about those cases having positive results, and then I saw how many of the big companies, the News Corps of this world, are making deals. Are making deals with AI companies now to share their archives and their new output. I think there is a sort of tendency among some of these executives to think, we let Facebook and Google get dominance, and we didn't get the bag then, so we should do it now with AI and make a deal rather than fight them. And I think it's a mistake in the long term. I really do.
Again, like you're not on staff, for the Telegraph, although like myself, you used to contribute to them and work with them. But I wonder if the contracts for people who are contributors, whether or not they've got more standing, right? Is because there's a Berne Convention on intellectual property means that the artist can't actually give away all their rights. So I wonder if there's some form of appeal, but again, that might be a completely.
I think it's difficult because I think it's stuff that you write when you're on staff somewhere, or even that you do as a freelance. It's kind of, those contracts tend to be like kind of a work to hire thing. They own the material. There's there's been a lot of battles in the past in the world of music journalism. There's a hell of a lot of battles for journalists who did big interviews in the past with big stars and who hadn't signed contracts where they gave up their rights to that material and fought and got paid for it in the end. But I think publishers learn to make their terms pretty restrictive going forward.
So, and then coming up to the end here, because I appreciate we've had some technical issues on my side, so I thank you for your patience. And but I want to also make sure we close out on a couple of things. But my big question to you is, you sound more optimistic on this conversation than I expected you to about the future. Do you think that the future is going to be in things like this, in individual creators and people who are kind of getting a product out there like yourself? Or is that the way forward, or does that way lie madness because it just reinforces this idea that every individual needs to be a brand?
Well,
I spend a lot of time doing.
I get it has to be a mixture, right? And for things like big investigations, things, you need some scale, you need some money behind you, you need some legal clout to do really heavy investigations. So I guess it's a mixture. I think this whole thing of having to be a brand is quite difficult. I struggle with it. Promoting a book, you have to sort of turn yourself even more into a little brand, and it's not. I don't think it's that easy, and I don't think that there are a lot of brilliant journalists who don't necessarily want to be, public figure, a kind of mini celebrity or public figure. They just want to make, they just want to tell interesting stories, and I think that's harder now. It's definitely harder, but I try to be somewhat optimistic because I think I'm quite negative a lot of the time, and I'm not sure where negativity gets us as well. That's the problem, isn't it? Being entirely negative doesn't get you anywhere.
And I think, again, in the book, closing out, you have a lot of constructive ideas about what can be done. What are some of the other things that the industry can do to save itself, as it were?
Well, I think that there are models like co-ops. There are independent journalists coming together to create, to work together to share resources is really important. I think, a platform like Substack is so interesting because it's done really well for getting a lot of independent creators some money and getting out there and being able to. Same thing with something like YouTube, but obviously the problem comes with, it's a little bit like, cable bundling made having lots of different channels cheaper. Now we're at a point where there's tons of streaming services, and that's really expensive, and you can't subscribe to every streaming service. So I think we're going to end up having those streaming services end up bundling in the end. And I guess the future of independent journalism is probably some element where you can bundle together creators that you like, because you can't pay everyone individually. So that's quite difficult. And again, for years we've had this big problem with, like, a paper article. People, every couple of years, people come up with a new idea, a new way of trying to push the pay-per-click or the you have a wallet and you pay for what you read kind of thing, and it never really works. But perhaps there is a future where something like that works, where you can have a pot of money that you are sharing amongst individual creators that you like. But I mean, if I had the answer to that, I'd be really rich, and I'd do that instead of doing what I'm doing.
Well, I do think it's interesting to see what people like Mehdi Hassan with Zeteo and the folks who started the Bulwark are doing, of trying to do that kind of a bit of, it's not quite a roll-up play. They are startups in their own right, and presumably starting with some seed capital to be able to get them off the ground and get a brand. But I do think it's certainly I look around at a lot of the other folks who work in this my space and think, like, what if we teamed up? Like, I'm terrible at admin. I'm absolutely rubbish at it. And so, like, if we could find a way to basically, combine resources and get that stuff, like, off my desk, then certainly, the various authorities would be much happier with me. So,
Yes.
Piling up the deadlines and all that stuff. Anyway, but look, so any final thoughts before, again, people must get the book Breaking. Sorry, let me just pause for a second. So, Nick Wright, again, thanks for coming on, man. Like, author, you gotta get the book Breaking: How the Media Works and Why It Matters When It Doesn't. Also, you got to check out Conquest of the Useless. But where else can people find you? And any final thoughts?
You can find me on, I guess Blue Sky is the place, really, but I'm everywhere as at Broken Bottle Boy. You can find me, and final thought would be, yes, this book is very is about the bad news of bad news, but hopefully it means that people will understand better how to find good news as well. That's what I want people to take away from it.
Well, that's a perfect place to leave it. Mick Wright, author of Breaking, thanks so much for coming on, man.
Thank you.
I've been in the right place, but it must have been the wrong time. I'd have said the right thing, but it must have used the wrong line. I've been on the right trail, but I must have used the wrong car. Head is in a bad place, and I wonder what's good for. I've been in the right place, but it must have been the wrong time. My head is in a bad place, but I'm having such a good time. I've been running, trying to keep tongue up in my mind. Just got to give myself a good talking to this time. Just need a little brain salad surgery.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you liked this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, the place where people and politics, technology and capital meet and shape the future. And whether it's one you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations, is a production of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.
Slipping, dodging, sneaking, peeping, hiding out down the street. See my life shaking with every who I meet. Root fried confusion if I'm making itself clear. Wonder which wrong